Welcome to our Axios virtual event on a global look at the future of democracy. I'm Dave Lawler, Senior World Reporter at Axios, and I'm coming to you today from Washington, D.C. Welcome to our audiences on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn, and on Axios.com. Join the conversation today on Twitter at @Axios and hashtag Axios events. Over the next 30 minutes, I'll be joined by my colleague, Sarah Kehulani-Gu, and we'll explore the future of democracy and how global leaders can uphold it in the face of mounting threats. Our first guest is the Administrator for the U.S. Agency for International Development, Samantha Power. Administrator Power, welcome.
Good to be here.
I want to start with the trajectory of democracy around the world. And as you well know, conversations on this topic over the past several years have tended to be pretty pessimistic. Freedom House says we've had 17 straight years of democratic erosion. But you recently wrote in Foreign Affairs that, quote, after years of democratic backsliding, the autocrats are finally on the defensive. Why do you say that?
Well, first, let me just say that even the language of erosion and recession and backsliding, there's a kind of passive voice to all of that, rather than, I think, something that we all need to embrace as a present day truth, which is it's not happening by some act of God. There are individuals who are attacking democracy from within and from without. And I think that's a conceptual shift that changes our mindset, but it also changes our toolkit, which maybe we can come back to. On your point about how to end the era of pessimism and, are there bright spots out there that one can focus on? I think there are a couple dimensions to that. I mean, for starters, the Russian Federation, of course, in Ukraine, in part, arguably because of the system in place in Moscow, really miscalculated, blundered very badly. Has inflicted horrific pain, of course, on the Ukrainians, and that's the most important consequence of that. But also, you can see the features of such centralized control really depriving the Putin regime of access to information, dissent, deliberation of the kind that can actually achieve the desired results. In this case, of course, a horrific result is sought. But Russia's on its back heel globally. The fact that you have nearly 130 countries at the UN coming out to denounce it. People focus on who isn't voting with Ukraine, but I would focus on who is, as somebody who used to be UN ambassador and knows how hard it is to get countries to get off the fence and stick their necks out. This is a very substantial show of Russia's isolation. And, with the PRC, which, of course, has made inroads in so many parts of the world through its Belt and Road initiative, you also see with the handling of COVID and the lack of transparency, results that are not what many were anticipating a top-down regime would achieve. And this has ebbed and flowed, the question of the handling of COVID throughout the pandemic from the beginning and the major questions around COVID origins, right through to the present in terms of how to handle lockdowns and so forth. But the bottom line is that both with that and with the amount of debt that many countries have incurred in inviting Belt and Road investments, which may have been very useful, let's say, in building a road, but have left so many countries saddled with high interest payments that make it actually impossible to rebuild health systems, education systems, invest in agriculture. And so there's a lot of that buyer's remorse out there with countries saying, wait, really, was this lack of transparent contracting in the interests of our citizens? And citizens are rising up and saying, hey, if you did a bunch of those deals and our kids and grandkids are going to be paying the price and paying off these loans, for decades into the future, maybe that kind of government that was in place doing things under the cover of darkness, maybe we need to look again at the importance of checks and balances, the importance of independent media, the importance of strong institutions. So I think there's a moment. I don't want to overstate it. You still see countries that are slipping when it comes to indicators around human rights, around democracy. But it is noteworthy that amid a 17-year slide, according to Freedom House, this year saw the slowest pace of decline. And indeed, while you had 35 countries backsliding when it comes to democratic indicators. You had 34 countries going in a positive direction. That's the first time we've seen those kinds of numbers in a very long time.
Got it. And you raise this idea that the authoritarian system doesn't necessarily deliver the kind of outcomes that the population is looking for in all of these contexts you just raised. But obviously, you've seen the numbers that I have about dissatisfaction in a lot of countries with what democracy is delivering. In terms of the work that you do and just more generally, how do you counter that perception that democracy doesn't deliver what people hoped and expected it would?
Well, I'd say a couple of things. I mean, first, people are very alert to what is happening in their own lives. And so this is easier said than done, but the absolute best way to respond when you see those trust numbers or those concerns about democracy's strength is to deliver. Again, easier said than done, and especially in polarized societies where you see for example, even in the United States, a lot of gridlock where views on what should be done really break down on party lines. Doing big things is harder. And that's true even in parliamentary democracies around the world. But I will say there's been more learning, I think, over the last 3 or 4 years about the importance of concrete, tangible improvements in people's lives to this question of trust than there had been, I think, in the previous decade. I don't have the polling to back this up or an empirical study to cite in this regard, but you can just feel in policy circles that conversations that used to be about democracy in the abstract and elections and political party strengthening and even programming of the kind that USAID and other development organizations would do is now shifting to seeing the connection between economic results and political legitimacy. And again, that will sound obvious maybe to many and what took people so long. And I think it's not that, we weren't doing economic development or strengthening the health sector or trying to improve energy efficiency. All those kinds of programs occurred, but the democracy programs kind of existed over here in a separate space. And so now when we see a political reform opening in a country like the Dominican Republic or in Zambia, where the country has been saddled with debt to the PRC for infrastructure projects that haven't even really come to pass, to be able to come in as USAID, as the United States, but also as a broader democratic community and say, well, these are really interesting reforms that are afoot. How do we make sure that the private sector shows up at just that moment and potentially new jobs are created? If there's a fertilizer initiative that USAID is undertaking, there's so much need for fertilizer around the world. Well, if we have a place where democracy is on the march and the indicators are going in the right direction, I, as a steward of the American taxpayers' resources, have more confidence in a country that's fighting corruption that fertilizer is going to go to its rightful destination than I might in a country that is backsliding. So just to see the ways in which that democracy dividend plays out in the real world and anything catalytic we can do to ensure that those who are doing brave things in the political space, perhaps opening themselves up to checks and balances, being held accountable, letting the media be more critical, allowing opposition rallies as now have been reauthorized in the country of Tanzania. When countries are doing those things, we want, as the United States, to be affirming that and also really paying attention to economic delivery, which of course is what governments are primarily focused on in the first instance.
And you talk about the link between economic development and democracy. When we sort of pull those things apart, if we've heard from some countries that they do want to talk about economic development, they certainly want to talk about investment. They don't necessarily want the US to come into their country and talk about democracy and human rights, particularly at a time when the US democracy has been under greater scrutiny than in recent years. As someone who does travel around the world and talk about democracy, and the links with these other issues, how do you navigate that tension?
Well, first, there's no one size fits all. There's no, I got my playbook here in Washington, I'm going to go take that on the road. I mean, it's so context specific. There is sensitivity around the world about perceptions that the United States, is or could be in some world, in asking countries to choose, to turn their backs on investments from some countries in favor of investments from others. I think there are areas where choice is important, like in information infrastructure, 5G, et cetera. The real ramifications when it comes to human rights of going in one direction versus the other direction. But by and large, I think what we do when we engage countries on the health of their democracies is we do so with a lot of humility. Everyone around the world knows what happened on January 6th. Everyone around the world knows when they have an election, that a major economy, a major superpower like the United States, has residual issues with recognition of election results. Everyone knows that. So for us to kind of head into a country and deliver our talking points about their democratic institutions or checks and balances without self-awareness about their knowledge of what's going on in our country and our struggles, which we seek to work through, that would be tone deaf in the extreme. So I think meeting people where they are, both in terms of how we convey the message, but also, recognizing there are these empirical studies that are very telling on just how important accountability is to the proper expenditure of state resources. In other words, when policies are put in place that bury or shroud what a country is doing in secrecy, and there is no sunlight, when elections are stolen or certain communities are not able to get to the polls, and thus you can't have representative governance, and thus those who are frustrated by particular policies or programs or see the corruption and then can't have their voices heard, that means you're not going to root out the corruption. You're not actually going to create more effective policies, but that dialogue is very specific to specific places. And so really digging into what the particular challenges are that the communities USAID works in, the United States works in, that's a huge part of it.
Right. Well, that's all the time we have. Administrator Power, thank you so much for joining Axios.
Thank you, David.
And next, we'll have a View from the Top segment with Axios publisher, Nicholas Johnston.
Thanks, Dave, and thanks to our sponsor, the Skoll Foundation, for making this conversation possible. Now joining us is President and Chief Operating Officer of Skoll Foundation, Marla Blow. Marla, thanks for joining Axios.
Thank you, Nick. I'm looking forward to a great conversation.
So let's start big picture. These can be perilous times for democracies around the globe. From your vantage point at the Skoll Foundation, what is your 30,000-foot view of good things and bad things for democracies around the world?
Looking at the data, when I explore the reading at the Economist Intelligence Unit, when I look at the reporting coming out of Freedom House, I see language like global democracies in precipitous decline. I see language like 17th year in a row of global democracy slipping. I see the word stagnation at best as kind of the description of what we're looking at when it comes to democracy. So I would count myself as deeply concerned when I look at that. And I will say it does cause me a fair amount of anxiety. I get deeply, deeply anxious when I think about what that bodes. But I do also look at the bright spots, right? And when I think about some of the organizations that we have as partners, I think about organizations like Protect Democracy, Center for Tech and Civic Life. I see how much they are doing and how critical they are about bringing together the government, the business sector, social sector leadership, enabling collective solution building and catalyzing change in these systems. That gives me the breathes new life into my feeling of optimism and hope about where we're headed in this. And at the same time, I'm also worried about making sure that they have the resources they need to tackle these problems that we are facing, given the magnitude of these issues.
Well, I think that's a perfect segue to what I wanted to ask next, is how actually can these groups be supported? Like, what are the actions that the Skoll Foundation can take, for instance, or other groups in a concrete way to help further democracy around the globe?
At Skoll, what we can really do is look at opportunities to protect and support these organizations, both in terms of the grant making, but also enabling them to have partnership, enabling them to connect with others that are doing this work, creating coalitions, enabling them to foster and create better reach as they go about doing this work, and setting them up to really be in a position to operate from strength. And that includes making sure that they do have the funding that they can use to drive this work. So I'll give you an example. One of our organizations that we just talked about, Center for Tech and Civic Life, is really committed to the distribution of $350 million of private funding to supplement federal and state level funding to include and drive local election departments in preparing for and responding to the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic and administer safe elections. Right? Those are examples of the ways that we can enable them by working across different sectors to drive the kind of democratic process that can ensure the trust and integrity of the system.
Yeah, can you talk also a little bit more about maybe the outcomes you're looking for? What are the hallmarks of successful, thriving democracies, the types of things that you really want to encourage, that we should look for as far as growing to support these democracies?
We look for safe, free, fair, and trusted elections as descriptive of what we mean for success in this arena, right? We are thinking about the use of those kinds of terms. And when we look at what it takes, that means open, responsive, and accountable institutions that serve the needs of the entire public. And when I say entire public, I'm talking about equity, I'm talking about inclusion, I'm talking about ensuring that the voices of all of the people are heard as they participate in how they are governed. And that is a way of describing kind of what an engaged electorate can mean and what that can drive in terms of buy-in and constructive approach to democracy. So those are the kinds of hallmarks that we are most committed to, and those are the things when those pieces fall off, we get some of what we're seeing right now.
Right. Can you take us to the ground level? What are some of the programs that you've been supporting in different countries that you seem to be thinking making a difference?
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about Protect Democracy. It's another organization that we've partnered with. They use a nonpartisan, multidisciplinary approach to address authoritarian threats to democracy. One of the key tools they use is a platform that they've built called Vote Shield. Vote Shield is in place in 24 states. And Nick, they have monitored and evaluated 150 million voter records across those states in the interest of safeguarding the health of our democracy and ensuring that there's the ability to detect and quickly address any kinds of irregularities or interference. Those are the kinds of innovations, the use of technology, the kind of multidisciplinary approach to ensuring that the process itself is of high integrity. That gives me a tremendous amount of comfort.
We've done this has been an interesting discussion about the size of the problem and the work needed to fix it. I wonder if we could end on a high note here and all that you see. What is the thing that fills your heart most with joy about the possible upside in the future for democracy and the work that you do?
In the end, a successful democracy rests in the people. And when I look at the people and the public response in India, in Brazil, in parts of West Africa, in the United States, and most recently in Israel, I see reminders everywhere that the strength and protection and the engagement of those communities really is dependent on that kind of widespread vigilance and willingness to make voices be heard, right? Shining a light on what's happening. And I'll borrow that phrase from the Washington Post, right? Democracy dies in darkness. And the citizens are the light. They are that line of resistance, and seeing the kind of response and the kind of demonstrations that we are seeing right now gives me tremendous hope that we are headed in a direction to change some of those statistics that we started off talking about.
At Engaged Citizenry, that's a great note to end on. Marla, thanks so much for joining Axios and making this conversation happen.
Thank you, Nick. Pleasure's mine.
And now over to my colleague, Sarah Kehaulani-Gu.
Thanks, Nick. I'm Sarah Kehaulani-Gu, the editor-in-chief of Axios. And for our final guest, I'm thrilled to welcome the CEO of Rappler and the 2021 Nobel Peace Prize laureate, Maria Reyes. She joins us now from Manila. Welcome, Maria. It's so great to see you.
Wonderful seeing you again, Sarah. Great to be here.
You're the perfect guest to really talk about press freedom and democracy. And there's so much that has changed in your life and for Rappler in just 1 year. I'd love to catch our guests up on just what's happened. When I last saw you, less than a year ago, Rappler was under threat of being shut down. And you were very concerned about your personal safety as well as journalists who worked for Rappler. And as many might have read in January, just a few months ago, so a lot of those legal charges were scrapped. And of course, the Philippines has a new political leader at the helm. So I would love to catch up quick and just first give us the state of play on press freedom for yourself personally, as well as Rappler and the press in the Philippines.
So it's all kind of connected, right? Part of it is, I think we hit that Silicon Valley of death. I think we hit the valley of death and we're hopefully going forward. Look, who would have thought the last administration was so bad that when Ferdinand Marcos Jr., the only son and namesake of our dictator for almost 21 years, when he came into power, things actually got slightly better, believe it or not. I hope to see it get significantly better. And this connects to the charges that we faced. In 2019, I started warrants every 6 weeks or so. There were 10 in less than 2 years. And then from that time up until today, we've now seen 7 of these criminal charges drop. What you referred to on January 18th this year, I mean, I walked into court ready for a guilty verdict that could have sent me to jail for 34 years. So to be vindicated, to have this thrown out of court, both for me and Rappler, was a huge burden lifted off our shoulders. For one, it takes the pressure off our business, right? These criminal cases of tax evasion were thrown at us 6 months after the Philippine government actually gave us an award for being a top corporate taxpayer. So we are where we are right now. The air is still tainted. There's 3 more charges. I hope to be able to fight them and win them before the end of the year. And I guess what I've learned in this whole time is it took a long time, 4 years and 2 months, took a lot of resources, time, energy, and stress, but slowly the world is turning right side up. Does it mean it can't turn upside down immediately? I think that's the uncertainty of the world we live in today. And I don't think it's just in the Philippines, Sarah.
Yeah, well, thank you for that update. I read that when those charges were dropped, you said famously, facts win, truth wins, justice wins. What an incredible victory. And I think the world has seen the fight that you have put up for press freedom. But I want to ask you, do you feel personally safer than you did a year ago? Do you feel safe walking the streets of as a journalist, as a leader of a news organization there?
You can't tell, I mean, yes, I have to say slightly yes, because 34 years of potential jail just fell off, just like this, right? And if you look at the verdict, it basically says these cases shouldn't have made it this far in court, but it did. And so it almost feels like we're walking on quicksand. You keep looking for, solid ground, and you keep moving forward, which is what we've done since 2016. So I think our biggest problem, like yours, is really what happens when trust is destroyed. Because that's the problem with our information ecosystem today. It puts journalists on a back. You're basically defending when you should be doing great journalism, but the incentive structure distribution is set up against us. We are set up to fail.
Right. And you've spoken out a lot about social media, and I want to get to that. But before we do, you always have a great global perspective. And last week, we saw an American journalist from the Wall Street Journal arrested by Russian officials under charges of spying, quote unquote, which the Wall Street Journal vigorously denies. And a lot of global news organizations have come to under his support and the paper's support. So give us the global picture. Where does the threat still remain? Obviously, Russia is being noticed, and you're a fellow winner of the Nobel Peace Prize was a Russian journalist, and your 2 stories are quite different a few years later after winning that prize.
Well, I mean, if you think about it, within 4 months of being in Oslo to receive the prize, both of our news organizations were threatened with shutdowns. And of course, you know, now Dmitry has faced and is facing the same type of legal charges. Novaya Gazeta has essentially shut down in Moscow. I think what's happened with the Wall Street Journal, essentially, there's a new low. It's gotten worse. I don't know if we can even measure it. I've called this death by 1,000 cuts, and it is the journalists who are on the front lines who are bearing the brunt of it. After we've seen a prisoner exchange with Russia with Brittany Griner, you know, Brittany was released, but who was released on the U.S. side in replacement to replace her? Well, now we're seeing something again. If you look at the news, you know this better than I would, right? But it feels like we're walking into far dangerous times. Anyone working in situations where authoritarianism has become fascism are going to have to really gauge the dangers. It is significantly worse for journalists than it's ever been.
Right, because journalists are in many cases used as pawns in this larger political power struggle, and the facts are quite elusive and confusing, often by design. You've talked, and we've talked before, about social media's role in amping up misinformation, being used for disinformation campaigns. And I wonder, we've been all following the latest new technology, new being used in a new way, actually, with generative AI. Are there lessons that we can apply that we need to really start focusing now as leaders, as those of us in the news world, those of us just in government or in business, about the applications or potential misuse of AI when it comes to mass media and distribution of facts versus of falsehoods?
Yeah, and Sarah, I'm going to answer this in 3 points. You know, first, I think that we haven't been aggressive enough to call out the change in our information ecosystem, which is, it isn't necessarily misinformation, but disinformation that's far more dangerous. The incentive structure of these technology platforms rewards lies over facts. You know, this was a 2018 MIT study, can go from 6 to 10 times further, which means we journalists are shackled because we have a set of standards and ethics. We don't lie. We're not going to incite anger, hate, or tribalism. And yet that is what is constantly rewarded. And you can see these on these technology platforms. What happens when that happens is a corruption, not just of the information that travels, but down to the values that infuse society. And the impact is at the personal level. You saw this January 6, 2021 on Capitol Hill, January 8 in Brazil's at the personal level, right? Our emotions are used to change what we think and ultimately the way we act. And this, I've said these 3 sentences repeatedly over and over. When you don't have facts, you can't have truth. Without truth, you can't have trust. Without these 3, we have no shared reality. We cannot have democracy. But take that one step further, which is, if you reward lies, like Sarah, you tell your child or you tell somebody you're helping mentor, you know, lie all the time, and I'm going to keep rewarding you. What kind of person, what kind of society do we create? This is what we're living with. The incentive structure for distribution is upside down. Now, on top of that, add this extra layer of generative AI, which by design, again, if you listen to Sam Altman of OpenAI, he says, well, it's really dangerous. Well, the question, of course, is if it is really dangerous, then why release it to the public? This is only going to get worse. And the last part about this is we've used generative AI in Rappler, right? During our May 2022 elections, there were 18,000 posts, and what we did is about 50,000 pages were created by GPT-3, which is the precursor of what was just released by OpenAI, but we labeled it. And then we had Rappler Research check it. Well, today, we have no idea. Of course, GPT-4 nor ChatGPT, they don't release what data they feed the AI, right? And garbage in is garbage out. So if they took, and they essentially said they have, if they took the unstructured big data of social media, which is coming out like like sewage. I called it toxic sludge in the Nobel lecture, but it is pumping out. If they took that and they fed that to the AI, then you have more lies than facts because it spreads faster, it generates faster. Then you have an AI that, by their own admission, they claim hallucinates. So if just normal content, if information operations has already turned the world upside down and making it impossible to govern, I feel sorry for governments today, democratic governments, because they are left with no choice but to either incite hate, to follow what will get distribution, right? So if this is what is coming through, we have to get ready. It's going to get worse before it gets better, if it gets better. And the last part is, I've said this repeatedly again, between January this year and 2024, there will be 90 elections globally. If you do not have integrity of facts, you cannot have integrity of elections. This is part of the reason we are electing illiberal leaders democratically. And once they take power, they crush the institutions of democracy from within their country, but they don't stay in their countries. They then ally globally. This is part of what we're seeing. Sorry, I sound so like this is horrendous. Essentially, I'm saying this is it, and we must do something about it. OpenAI has just made things worse.
Yeah, it's yet another challenge on getting our arms around technology that feels a bit an uphill battle, especially for journalists. And Maria, I always really respect your perspective and value your viewpoints here on this, given all that you've gone through. And we really appreciate your time with us today. I think we'll have to leave it there. But thank you so much for joining this really important conversation about democracy and press freedom.
Thanks for having me, Sarah.
Thank you all for joining us this morning for another virtual conversation with Axios. For more information, you should sign up for David Lawler's Axios World newsletter or any of our other newsletters at axios.com/newsletters, or you can download our Axios app. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you again on axios.com.
Yeah.